but broadly speaking, the Washington Post, Wesley and his team, created a database to track fatal police-involved shootings in real time. And I know I've heard you talk a little bit more yesterday and today. Even when that project launched, people thought just by virtue of the fact you wanted to count this, that you were anti-police. And really nothing could be further than the truth. Tell us a little bit about, what prompted this effort and why you wanted to start counting.
Sure. So we launched this project in 2015, and it was an outgrowth, as I think a lot of the best big journalistic projects are, of the daily journalism that we were doing every day. Right? I'd been in Ferguson, Missouri, covering the police shooting of Michael Brown, the unrest there after that, then ultimately the decision not to charge Officer Darren Wilson in that case. From there, we'd gone to New York, where there'd been a decision not to charge the officer in the case involving Eric Gardner. Then I went back to my hometown of Cleveland, where 12-year-old boy Tamir Rice had been shot and killed, and there was now protest and debate over what should happen in that case. And so as 2014 turned into 2015, we were having a discussion at the Post about what we might do, how we might continue to do journalism that made a difference. Oh, keep them close?
Cozy right up.
No, we can do that. I want to make sure everyone can hear. All right, there we go. Appreciate that assist. As 2014 turned into 2015, we were having a debate at the Post about how we could continue to push this conversation forward. It was clear the nation was having a conversation about policing, about race, about issues of justice. So what could we do that would contribute to that conversation? Now, at the time, I'd been a political reporter. I'd come to cover Congress, and then my goal was to cover 2016, which I just thought was just going to be this battle of ideas, this hyper-substantive presidential election, right? I dreamed of helping participate in. And so as 2015 began, my editors came to me and said, all right, well, look, if you still want to do politics, you can do politics. We'll put you on Scott Walker or Jeb Bush, one of the more attractive candidates of 2016, right? One of the best assignments you could get, because one of these guys is definitely going to win the nomination. Or, if you want to think up a project, you can keep doing this policing stuff. You seem to enjoy it. You've been pretty good at it. You've been involved in this story at a high level. If you want to do this, you can do it. And so I said, yeah, I don't want to listen to Scott Walker give speeches. Let's do something on policing and justice. Now, we've been having this big conversation about policing and about police shootings. And one of the main battle lines in this debate was, are these shootings happening too often? Are the police killing too many people? And who are the victims? Are they disproportionately black or Hispanic? What are the factors here? Is there a racial component to this? But we were having this conversation at a time when we didn't have any national data on how often police shootings happen. That the way we do policing in the United States of America is that policing is a local government issue. There are 19,000 police departments, and no one can really tell that local police department what to do or how they operate. The sheriff is the boss of the sheriff. The voters are the boss of him. The police chief reports to the council or to the mayor, but the state and much less the federal government can't demand of a local police department much information about what's happening. Now, often they work collaboratively, but at the end of the day, the local police department owns its information and is only responsible to its voters and its residents, not to the whole country. So what we knew was that we didn't have a comprehensive look at how often these fatal police shootings happened. Now that was, for me, as a journalist, as a data person, as a stats person, and as a public records person, I found it kind of shocking, right? Here we are, it's 2014, we have statistics of everything, right? The movie theater can tell you exactly how many people went and saw the latest movie and how many of them bought popcorn, right? We know exactly how many shark attacks there were off the coast of California, how many barrels of corn there are in Iowa, but we don't know how many police shootings had happened in the country. That just seemed very odd. And again, that's not to suggest that every police shooting is unjustified or bad or shouldn't have happened, but how would we even begin to decide if it was happening too often if we didn't know how often it was happening? And we couldn't begin analyzing what the cases were. So we launched this project in 2015 to count ourselves as many police shootings as we could in real time, to try to get a sense of how often is this happening. The way we did it was we set up a series of complex Google alerts. Two of my colleagues, Jennifer and Julie, really pioneered this, where we figured out that if someone is shot and killed by a police officer in America, you can't always get it through public records. The police department doesn't always announce it. But at least one journalist one time writes it down. It ends up in the local crime blotter at the very least. It ends up one public radio reporter or television reporter stands at the scene of the crime scene tape and says, here at the scene of the officer-involved shooting for the new newscast. And so we figured out that if we could be meticulous enough and search every single day for any new cases that had popped up on Google, we could start building a spreadsheet of every case that had been publicly reported of a police shooting. Then we could go back and ask additional questions, right? So even if the local reporter had to move on to the next story, we could call a week later and say, hey, so whatever happened with that police shooting from last week? Did you ever figure out who the victim was? Did you ever get more details about what happened? And so we slowly started building a database. Now, at the time, I mentioned that there wasn't good federal data. There was a number. The Department of Justice does put out a number every year of how many officer-involved shootings there are, but it's a voluntary, self-reported number. So once a year, they call all 19,000 police departments and say, how many people did you guys kill? And 3,000, 4,000 of those departments return the phone call. And then DOJ puts out a press release and says, this is how many officer-involved shootings there have been. So the Department of Justice knew this was going to be a massive undercount, right? And so according to that data, there had never been more than 462 fatal police shootings in the United States of America in a given year. And so we're thinking, if by the end of 2015 we've got 500 police shootings, that's a pretty major story. 50 police shootings that the federal government missed in its data collection, that would be a lot. We were at 500 by May of that year. By the end of the year, we had recorded 993 fatal police shootings, right? And so the upshot of the first year of this investigation was that the police, in fact, shoot and kill twice as many people as the federal data would lead us to believe. That was an important finding. Again, all we're asking is if we want to have a conversation about this thing that's happening in the public. Is it happening too often? Who are the victims? And so we have to start by figuring out how often it's happening at all. And it was pretty stunning to us that 3 times every single day in America, someone is shot and killed by a police officer. From there, and we continue to do this project. You can go on the WashingtonPost.com today and you can find our databases for 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19. I'm pretty sure 2020 stood up and we've started that as well. You can look at every single case, who the person was, what the circumstances were, where it was, what ended up happening in the case. And so we found a few other things in this project, right? We found that, one, yes, police shootings were happening every single day. It's a daily occurrence in America. 2, that many, many, many of the people who are killed in these cases are armed and perhaps threatening the police officer in some way. We did find there was a significant number of unarmed people being killed in these cases, or people who were armed legally, who were answering the door to their own home, carrying their own legally owned gun, right? We live in a country where no matter our politics, the law says we're allowed to have firearms, right? And so just the presence of a firearm doesn't necessarily mean the person deserved to have been shot and killed in that case, right? Sometimes there's more complexity than just if the person was armed or if they were unarmed, right? We found that there were racial disparities. While the majority of people shot and killed by American police are white, the majority of Americans are white. So you would kind of expect that. But as we started drilling into the statistics, what we found was that Black Americans were disproportionately represented in terms of how often this was happening. Not only in all shootings, but specifically in unarmed shootings too, right? That there was a big racial disparity there. And we also found a big role that mental health and the brokenness of our mental health system played. That our very conservative estimate was that at least 1/3 of the people who are shot and killed by the police are in the midst of some type of mental health crisis at the moment of the shooting. And that number could probably go up as high as about half. Like I said, we were very conservative in which cases we marked that way and which ones didn't. And so what it allowed us to do for the first time was to really wrap our hands and arms around this issue in totality and begin to answer some questions about it. Like I said at the beginning, we got a lot of pushback. Why would you count this? By putting this number out here, you're inferring that every one of these shootings is bad or the police are to blame for all. And we said, no, that's not what we're doing at all. We just want to know the answer to the question. If we're going to have a big national conversation about police shootings, we should know how many police shootings happened in the nation. And only with that information can we begin having a more complicated conversation about should there be different training, should there be different tactics, are there internal biases that are, we can't even begin to have that conversation till we have the numbers. And so that was a big part of our project there.
And let me ask you, and this is working?
Yep.
Okay. What did the federal data show in terms of how many shootings there were in Florida?
So for example, and this underscores the failing nature of the federal data collection effort. Again, all voluntary, all self-reported. According to the federal data, there's never been a police shooting in the history of the state of Florida. Why? Because the Florida police departments, none of them report their data. Right? According to the federal data, the shooting of Tamir Rice in Cleveland didn't happen. The shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson didn't happen. Because again, those police departments, for whatever reason, did not report their data. And so it speaks to how incomplete the federal data was. It was just functionally useless as an analytical tool because so many departments weren't reporting.
So data collection, having the information is an important step toward addressing news, presenting news and addressing news literacy issues. But then conveying it to people is the other critical piece. When we talk about the state of news literacy today, what do you see as the biggest challenge?
So I think news literacy is really important, right? And it's a term we see and hear a lot. A lot of you guys are a public radio audience, and so you might know, so you probably heard that term. But if you haven't, it's this idea of, in a moment when we've got a lot of partisan media, we've got a lot of stuff on the internet that is questionably sourced, if sourced at all, how do we as a reader, as a consumer, figure out what we can trust and what we can't? And beyond that, how do we decipher what we're reading, even when it's something we can trust? Is this a columnist in their opinion? Is this a reporter, but they're writing some analysis, so maybe some of their opinions in it? Is this straight news? What's the difference between a big investigation or kind of a quick take that someone's written, right? And in the age of the internet, it can be really difficult to decipher those things. A lot of us are encountering a lot of our news essentially as links that our friends post on Facebook, right? That a lot of times things that aren't legitimate look really legitimate. Things that are legitimate maybe don't look that good because the source needs to update their website, or that, and so how do we collectively make sure that we are being able to decipher what information we're receiving, and how are we responsible news sharers and news consumers, right? Making sure that we don't post the thing that we know isn't true. We've all done that. We've all been guilty of it, right? We read a thing that's too good to be true from a website we've never heard of before, and we share it on Facebook. Or the politician we really don't like, no matter who they are, of whatever party, we find an article that confirms the worst thing we ever imagined about them, right? Like, see, Hillary Clinton didn't murder 7 people, she murdered 8 people. We share this on Facebook, right? No, Donald Trump really is a Russian plant. Okay, let me share, where we see this happening very frequently, and we all see it. If it's not us, it's our family members, it's our friends, it's our old college roommate, it's whomever, sharing information that we can quickly decipher isn't legitimate. But like I said, it's so hard in this moment for us, for all of us, to decipher what we should believe and what we shouldn't believe. And so the idea of news literacy is, how do we all train ourselves to decipher reliable sources from non-reliable sources, to be responsible news consumers and to be responsible news sharers, so that we're not contributing to this problem. And so that's kind of what we think about and talk about when we talk about news literacy.
As a reporter, I have to imagine one of the things, a national reporter, that can be very challenging is social media, is the internet. And you were talking about, I believe you were talking about when you were in Ferguson, can happen anywhere, and tweets are going out constantly from the community, from activists, from people in the streets, from protesters, from whoever. And you used the term when you interviewed with our reporter Ben Thorpe, the land of a million sleuths. So we have people sitting home getting these tweets, getting these Facebook updates, getting these notifications and alerts, and looking at the reporter saying, well, you said this, but this tweet said otherwise. How do you address that? How do you combat that when you are reporting on a story that's so big and is drawing so much attention?
It's really difficult, right? We live in an era where we all think we can kind of do it ourselves. of everyone's job, right? We watch cooking shows and go, well, what's the chef doing it that way, right? We watch the medical shows and diagnose the cases ourselves because we've watched the show enough. We know how this really works, right? We live at a time where we all believe we have expertise, whether we actually have the expertise or not. And one thing, and I think in journalism, two different things are true. The first is that anyone can do journalistic functions. Anyone can do journalism, can create journalism, anyone can write, people can do reporting, people can publish things in the public record. That said, there is also a journalistic expertise. There are best practices, there are standards, there are ethics, there are ways that certain people in the journalism industry writ large operates that your average person just kind of winging it might not. And so it's important that we support news outlets that are upholding those types of standards, but also as someone who attempts to do journalism that way, it can be very difficult as you're reporting something and everyone sitting on their computer goes, oh no, well I just Googled this and I found different information, so you must be wrong. Right? We have that inclination sometimes to seek out whatever information we can find and prove or disprove the thing we're reading and interacting with. Now, as journalists, I think in some ways that can be a good thing, right? It's an engaged readership. I think it's important that we have a readership that can hold us accountable. Sometimes we do get things wrong. Sometimes we have overlooked context, and I welcome those tweets and those emails and those phone calls, right? And I think as journalists, it's our job to try to be as responsive as possible, right? There are times where I get a very incensed email from a reader, and the reader is just wrong. You overlooked this piece of, no, actually we didn't. It's mentioned in paragraph 5. Oh, yeah, you're right. Well, what about this thing? Well, actually, that thing is a totally different example. You're misreading what the other thing is. Oh, yeah, okay. And so I think that, but again, I think that transparency and that accountability is a good thing. I think those back and forths are important. And so I try to, when possible, even if the person's angry, even if the person seems a little politically partisan one direction or the other, if at the core I think they're trying to make a legitimate point to me, I try to respond to them. You get in trouble with that sometimes, because now you're 82 emails later and you're up at 3 a.m. researching. No, actually, Kevin, it's this other thing. So sometimes you gotta step away from it, right? But I do think it's important for us as journalists to that we can be held accountable by the public and that we talk to people. And if people have questions about the work we do, if people think we've missed something, to hear them out.
Let's talk more about transparency from the news organization, because that is something that I think readers and listeners, viewers can look to have a sense for, to some extent, the credibility of that organization. What are some things that you would kind of say are best practices or important for news organizations to do in terms of transparency, openness to their consumers?
I think that, first of all, I think that we need to make it easy for our news consumers to contact us. It shouldn't be a mystery. Even if you just want to tell me I have a typo or I've made a grammatical error, and a lot of readers like that, right? You should be able to find my email and tell me that. You shouldn't have to go on a Nicolas Cage National Treasure scavenger hunt to figure out how to say, hey, you said the mayor's name is Bob, it's really Rob. I think that's a big part of it. I think that we need to be more transparent about how we do the reporting of our stories sometimes, right? Historically, traditionally, at a newspaper or a major news outlet, we are the voice of God, right? The Washington Post has discovered. We don't tell you where we discovered it or how we discovered it. We tell you that the thing has happened. And I think we have to be more willing to bring our readers with us on the journey of how we did the journalism. Here's one really good example of that. And I had nothing at all to do with this journalism. But my colleagues at the Washington Post, 2 years ago now, did a bunch of reporting on a Republican Senate candidate named Roy Moore in Alabama. And we stumbled into the information. One of our reporters, Stephanie McCrumman, was in Alabama reporting a completely different story that had nothing to do with any of these allegations. And someone mentioned to her, as she's talking to people, doing her job as a reporter, oh, well, Roy Moore likes to pick up teenage girls at the local mall. She goes, what are you talking about? So she starts asking questions of other people. Have other people heard this rumor? Is it documented? Has it been reported? Who are the girls who this has happened to, right? And suddenly, we've got a whole investigation into the Senate candidate and whether or not he's been behaving inappropriately with these younger women. Now, when we publish the story, we included some language in the story that is very different than the Washington Post typically includes. And what it was it noted the way we had discovered this story, Tim. It said, a Washington Post reporter was in Alabama interviewing people about an unrelated story when someone mentioned that it had long been rumored that Roy Moore did X, Y, and Z. Then, based on other interviews, we found victims or people who'd been involved in these cases. We made it clear we hadn't been given this by his political opponents, for example. This wasn't an oppo dump. This wasn't right? I think that's important for us to do, to show people where the journalism comes from, right? I think sometimes as journalists, we assume that everyone assumes the best of us, right? Well, these are defenders of the First Amendment, are out here working hard to save democracy and just writing down the truth. I think in the best case scenario, the average reader is kind of 50-50 on us. Well, like, all right, maybe they're crooks, maybe they're not. Let me read the thing and let me see. And I think we should do everything in our power to show people that we're just trying to be fair. Here's where we got this story from. This is what we got. This is what we tried to do. These are the people we called and they wouldn't call us back. So look, if they say something later, we welcome that. We didn't hear from them. We tried. We knocked on their door. I think we have to educate our readers sometimes about how we do the work that we do and how we get the story ideas we get, if only to disarm the reader from thinking that it's a political conspiracy or a setup or an agenda. Because like I said, if any of you have ever spent any time, certainly in a newspaper newsroom or any newsroom, right, we can't conspire together to order new coffee, right? We're never going to be able to conspire on a story, right? These are remarkably unorganized workplaces where we're all just kind of working together every single day to try to do the best we can. And so I think the more we can show our readers that, the better and more receptive they will be of the journalism we're doing.
You know, I find this important and interesting because when I train students at WCMU, they work for us, and if you listen to us, you've heard some of them on the air. They're treated just like any other reporter. They're edited. They may have to go back and rewrite 5 or 6 times, if that's what the story takes. One of the lines I use, and I heard you mention it, I think yesterday, that I'm constantly telling them is show, don't tell. Don't tell me a large crowd turned out to hear Wes Lowery speak. Tell me, 120 people attended in Midland. And then you know what? That respects the listener. That respects the consumer. You can tell me if you think that's a large crowd or not. It's not my job to tell you it's a large crowd. It's my job to tell you how many people were there. And then, we often say that in public media, of course, then you make your own decision. And I think as a consumer, that's something people can kind of watch for, is to avoid is the piece avoiding editorial language? Are they describing for you what they think a large crowd is? Or are they just telling you 120 people turned out?
And one thing we do a lot on these big data projects and also on big document projects, for example, so another good example, another project that posted that I had nothing to do with, but give me all the credit for because I think it was amazing work, was we recently did the Afghanistan papers, which was a massive report on what the federal government knew about the war in Afghanistan and how it did not line up with the public statements that many of our elected leaders were making. So Afghanistan has turned a corner. We hear again and again and again, and then privately they're going, this is a quagmire, how do we get out of this? My colleague Craig Wicklott did this reporting. This remarkable reporting got all these documents of these internal interviews that government officials had done about Afghanistan. And so in real time, we see what they're telling themselves and we see what they're telling the public. And we wrote, I thought they were excellent pieces that really explained and they were thematic and they looked at different parts of it. But we also published all the raw interviews and documents on the internet. So if you're hyper-skeptical or you don't want our analysis of it or you don't, look, the government documents are the government documents. And so what it allows us to do is even the reader who is skeptical of us is going to see value in clicking through and reading it ourselves. In a nation of millions of sleuths, there's nothing we like more than clicking through the documents ourselves and figuring out what the real story is. And so I think that we also have to lean into that idea, right? A lot of the journalism we do is built on public records, on documents, on interviews, on videos, on police reports, right? How much of that can we put into the public record? Just let our readers see. Because that way, one, they see that we're not just making this stuff up, right? They read the documents and they read the way we describe the documents and they go, even if I might quibble with the word choice, I understand, right? This doesn't seem agenda driven, or I get why you would describe 120 people as large when you look at the room and see that it's pretty full, right? If you allow people to see the decisions that we are making because they now have the raw material themselves, it's one way to show people that, look, even when we get something wrong, or even if you disagree with us, that it's well-intentioned and that we're working hard at it.
So I have one more question, and then I'll be turning it over to you. So if you want to give some thought, if you have questions to put to Wesley. Now, I often encourage people, if they're looking for a reliable news source, to look at NPR. So am I biased? Yes. But am I also correct? Well, again, yes. It's a good news source. And I believe you would say the same thing about the Washington Post. There are certain organizations that have a history of quality, of being responsible journalists. They've been around a long time, and they've done it well for a long time. Mm-hmm. What are some characteristics of those type of organizations that the average consumer can see? So when they come across a new organization, maybe they're looking at going, well, does this seem to meet that level of trust? That's
an excellent question. And I do think there are some ways that we can help differentiate, right? I think the first, and I think this is really important, it's not does this place never mess up, it's do they fess up when they mess up? Is this a place that when they make a mistake runs a correction? Or an editor's note? Is this a place that when they have a major scandal investigates it themselves and releases it publicly? Right? Or is this a place that when they get something wrong, they get called on it, tries to pretend it didn't happen? The types of organizations that are trustworthy are the types of organizations that see themselves as a public trust, where they think it matters, where they think it's important, where the Post, at NPR, the New York Times, at any number of places, again, none of these newsrooms are perfect. They certainly have their blind spots, they certainly get things wrong, but they spend a lot of time thinking about their role and what they owe the public, what they owe their readers. And if we get something wrong, we're going to be the first ones in line to try to correct that and fix that, right? You got a whole other set of organizations that don't want to do that or aren't interested in doing that, and I would be wary of those organizations. There are other things that I think can help assess at an individual article level or a news organization level whether you should trust something or not trust it, right? Are these pieces published by people using their real names? Or is this an anonymous report on a blog that's aggregating another one that's looking at, or is this Wes Lowery with his photo at the top of the story saying this is what it is? Or you can show up at my house and give me corrections on the piece that I worked on. There's a public accountability. You know who I am. People can walk up to me at the grocery store and say, you lied about that, right? One of the reasons we do that is so that I don't lie about stuff, right? That it's on my name. I'm publicly accountable to the things I write, to whether I'm fair, whether I'm telling the truth, whether I'm not. Again, some organizations aren't operating that way. I'd be a little more skeptical. When the organizations do things that are out of the ordinary, such as using an anonymous source, right? Because the gold standard is an on-the-record source, right? The most sources are on the record, and so if you're using someone who's anonymous, that's an extraordinary circumstance. Do they do things like explain to you why the source is anonymous? Right? Because again, what that speaks to is the idea that these are deliberate decisions that are abiding by some type of ethical code. Right? That it's not just they're winging it every single day and making up new decisions, but rather this is a place that uses anonymous sources under these types of circumstances and not these other ones. Those are the types of places you want to think about and lean into. Like I said, one of the other things I would say is if you encounter journalism, if you encounter a report that seems too good to be true or seems hyper excited or hyperbolic, those are the times, those are the news reports where you have to make sure you can get multiple sources on them, right? If something that extreme has happened, it's almost never going to be reported by just one place. And so I think that's also, especially in our political realm, right? If every place is reporting something in a not particularly incendiary way, but one source is saying it's remarkably incendiary, chances are that's the untrustworthy source. And so I think that's just something we got to think about sometimes, right? I think, especially in a social media world where we're interacting with headlines very casually, we went on to go check at the photos of our niece or our nephew, and now we're being countered with political stuff. And and we see a headline, and if it confirms something that we already want to believe, or do believe, or aligns with our politics, sometimes we're not as stringent as we should be about, wait, upon further analysis, this is clearly made up. And we just all have to remind ourselves to do that sometimes.
Well, and I said I was going to turn it over, but I want one follow-up, and that is...
She's already breaking the rules. Look
I
at this.
know, it's crazy, I'm out of control. I think we all get this, but I want to hear it from you, and that is, why is it so important to do this?
Look, I think we all want to live in a world where we have a shared, agreed-upon set of facts and reality. We don't have to interpret the facts the same way. We don't have to like the facts, right? The carpet's blue, and I wish it was red, but I want to live in a world where we all agree it's blue, right? How do we even begin to have a debate about whether or not it would be better if it was red carpet if we can't even start by agreeing that it's not red carpet? And I think that information is important. Information is power. Words have power. Photos have power. It's how we change the world we live in. It's how we process the world we live in. And so again, having agreed upon set of facts, having agreed upon set reality, is extremely important for us to begin altering that reality, changing that reality, sustaining the parts of it that we don't want to change, that we think work. I think having shared facts and shared information is how we mobilize people in our democracy. It's how we engage with our government. It's how I think we want people to know what's going on. And so I think those are all the reasons that things are important, right? I mean, we want to have an informed, mobilized, interested electorate and population. We want people to have access to information. We want people to be able to share their own stories, and because we want to know what's going on with the other people who not only live around us, but live far away from us, right? And we can only do that if we can figure out what sources we can trust, what shared language we're going to use, how we're going to tell those stories.
Thank you, and I am going to turn it over to the floor now. We're happy to take any questions you may have. I saw this hand way in the back up first, so we'll start back there.
I'll share a concern and get your opinion. My concern that's evolved over the past 20, 25 years is media is owned by fewer and fewer organizations.
Yes.
Both on a national level and on a local level. We're a rare town that the radio station across the street and the one at our baseball field are locally owned, but our newspaper is not locally owned. In most communities, none of it's locally owned. Then on the national level, the concern that sometimes it's not the news that's being presented, but the news that's not being presented. For example, when GE owned NBC, and they're also a defense contractor, Jeff Bezos, Amazon, owns Washington Post. I worry what news is or isn't being presented because of who owns the media. So your thoughts there?
You know, I think that not just myself, but I think a lot of my colleagues in the news media share those precise concerns. No concerns about my overlord Jeff Bezos. Don't say anything mean about Amazon, right? Hopefully he's not. That's a joke, right? You know, but I think there's a real concern there, and I think you accurately described the history of American journalism in a way where previously many more, even just talking newspapers, right? Because that's what I know the most about, right? Most newspapers came up locally owned. In most cases, you typically had two newspapers in a town. One was run by the Republicans, one run by the Democrats, right? So the richest Republican family bought a newspaper, the richest Democrat family bought a newspaper. And in many ways, you actually had a lot of good things come from the competition that comes out of that. Because at the end of the day, most news stories aren't particularly Republican or Democrat. Car crash is a car crash, a fire at the courthouse is a fire at the courthouse, right? Crime is a crime, right? And so having some competition, having two newspapers meant more got covered. More people were interviewed, more stuff made it into print, more information, more facts were retained historically. What we've seen over the last several decades, not just recently, I mean, going back 70s, 80s, 90s, was corporations buying up these newspapers. The newspapers, beginning with the newspaper chains, but then also private equity firms and others, right? And so suddenly, places that used to be family trust, local philanthropies, means of social capital, right? The rich family doesn't really make money off of their newspaper, but they get invited to a lot of good parties. And people return all their phone calls because they run the newspaper. And they got to make sure that that's going to happen. Suddenly, those were owned by corporate paper pushers who could make a little bit more money by laying off a few reporters. Couldn't we do more with less? Couldn't we improve efficiencies? And so suddenly fewer things were being reported. There were fewer journalists in these newsrooms. Some of the local functions were being exported out to regional and national places. And as you know, suddenly you had fewer and fewer owners who had control over what was being said and what was being reported. Now look, I do think that we have a robust media of all types of different outlets, some nonprofit, some still locally owned, some corporately owned, some owned by individual very rich people, like the place that I work for. And there are certainly conflicts that come with that. But what I look forward to, or what heartens me about that is that while publishing has always been largely an industry of people who have the money to afford publishing, that is in fact less and less true. That the barriers of entry today to someone who wants to break the rules or target the powerful person are much smaller than they were previously. In the past, you had to be able to afford a printing press and then walk around and hand out your newspaper. Today, essentially any person, if they can do the work, if they can get the information, they can find an audience for it. And I think that that's powerful, and I think, in fact, that's more democratic than perhaps it's been in the past, even as I acknowledge the deep issues I think we have with corporate ownership of news media.
Well, thanks for visiting Midland here. This is great. Get your crystal ball out. And, and where's journalism going the next 10 to 20 years? And the second part of that, would you recommend a college student to go into journalism? Yes or no, or why?
I would definitely recommend a college student go into journalism. I'm convinced it's one of the best jobs in the world. And the reason I say that is because I get to wake up every day, call people smarter than me, ask them a bunch of questions, and that was what I did at work. That's a really awesome job. And I think that it's a job where people rely on you for information. It's necessary. It's a job where you're learning every day, where you're meeting interesting people, going to interesting places you never would have gone before, seeing parts of the country you might not see otherwise. And again, creating a historical record. We think very often of journalism as a field that is serving us in the moment. But what we're also doing is we are creating the written record of our civilization, of our society, of this time, of what we cared about, of what our controversies were. That's going to help historians decades and centuries down the line figure out what was happening. And I think that's really important. That's really fun. You know, journalism moving forward, I think that we really have to figure out how we stem the local news crisis. That we've just got a lot of places that are barely hanging on, and they are losing so much of the historical record. They're losing so much of the accountability of local elected officials and local powerful people. There are so many stories not being told. I think we have to figure out what that looks like. I think journalism will end up being more nonprofit than it is currently. I think we've seen some successful models. The Texas Tribune is a good example of that. We've got the Salt Lake City Tribune has become the first kind of historic newspaper to try to do the shift from being a for-profit to a full nonprofit, and it's going to be fascinating to see if that works and what that if it does, if perhaps that's a model for some of our other local newspapers. But we've got to figure out what happens with local news. I think that is one of the keys. None of us, even those of us who work for the big places, none of us want to live in a place where our news environment and our news universe is just a handful of big places owned by really rich people. It's very important that we have a diversity of news outlets and people who are living in the communities that they're covering.
I'm going to second what Wesley just said here from a local perspective. And I'm just going to mention briefly, so you understand there is some work being done in real time. WCMU is working with local newspapers. It's one of the reasons we're here today in cooperation with the Midland Daily News. Because we have the opportunity to bring Wesley in through CMU, so here's yet another partner with their critical engagements program, and the Midland Daily News was able to help us host this. One of the reasons we have that partnership is because we are working with them to place an intern in their shop over the summer. So we have a lot of very bright, ambitious journalism students at Central Michigan University, and we want to offer them the best opportunity to begin learning the trade. And part of that is to expand it beyond simply print or simply broadcast journalism And Wesley can talk more about this if it comes up, but there certainly is a consolidation of expectations for reporters today. You don't just do print. You're going to do a podcast. You're going to do some interviews. You might do something for a broadcast source. And so having those skills is very important. So we are working this summer to put an intern, a full-time paid summer intern in the Midland Daily News. And they will then be learning both print and broadcast journalism, as well as then producing web pieces that go along with any journalism piece today. We're also putting students, if we find the right pool of students, in Traverse City, Bad Axe, Alpena, and Cadillac. So that is an example of one effort, I can speak of from the educational side of things, where we are working to address some of these news deserts, because we want the newspapers to survive. We want them to be vibrant and a rigorous source for news in their communities. And since we cover half the state of Michigan and many news deserts, we want to help with that effort. And so, these partnerships, I think, could be a piece of an answer into the future. Right here.
Yeah, I'm one of those people who repost a lot of things to Facebook, including articles from NPR, which are always great. Everybody can look at it. Anybody can tune in. It's a bit of a lead a horse to water, but you can't make a great situation. So many people don't listen to it. But I also subscribe to the Washington Post and New York Times. And the problem is when I repost those articles, I think there's a very small limit, something in the neighborhood of 3 articles that someone can open. And then if they're not a subscriber, they can't look at it. I'm worried that quality news is becoming a resource for rich people.
I worry about that too. I think about that all the time. Part also because our websites don't always remember that you're a subscriber, and so I'm sitting in the Washington Post like, why won't you let me log in? I need to read this article that I wrote. I do think about I think about that a lot. One thing that we have seen more often is, especially the Post and the Times, very often are now operating the way some of the wire services used to operate, where even if the digital access is limited online, the stories themselves are appearing in local newspapers, and so that's allowing for some of the spread of the information. It's a tough question, and it's a tough thing to deal with, right? Because it cuts in both directions. One of the mistakes a lot of newspapers made was we gave away so much of our content for free for so long. And so I'm very sympathetic to the argument that, no, look, we've got to be willing to say, look, we need people to support us through paying for this work. I certainly am not volunteering to give my salary back so some more of the articles will be free, right? We need to support our journalists, but also, I think you're right. It's at a time when people don't know necessarily what to trust or who to believe, or they should be consulting multiple sources, which I would suggest them to do. Can you expect everyone to have 19 different subscriptions and be paying? Well, that's just not completely realistic. And so I'm not all the way sure how we stem that and what we do. I don't know the answer to this. At the Post at one point we're doing a setup where if you subscribe to one of your local papers, we would give you a digital subscription. I don't know if that still exists. I honestly don't know the answer to it. But I think a lot about what setups like that might look like, how we might bundle news that way. And because I think we do have to, like I said, at the same time, we want people to support us through the work, but also accept that we want all of journalism to be strong and be making money. And so how do we, give some people some 2-for-1 deals that might get us more eyes on the good journalism, but also perhaps get some money to the local news outlets.
Right here?
Yeah, one of the practices that I think we need to redefine in journalism is the concept of what fair and balanced reporting means and looks like. I'm a scientist, a chemical engineer, and I work in healthcare, and I'm a PR person, and so
how many jobs do you have?
As you know, my career has been spent trying to get information out that's reputable, sourced scientific information, right? So one of my sources of frustration is we have these big, well-oiled machines that are out there creating misinformation, and they're the same organizations, and they hire people like licensed medical physicians and expert scientists so that it looks like their material is legit, right? And that's part of their mechanism. And we have young, new, inexperienced reporters coming along every year who don't know these are the same people that did, big tobacco 100 years ago, and then climate science denial. They're the same people that, the breast implant controversy against Dow Corning here in town was perpetrated by. And so I think the problem is we've trained journalists that fair and balanced reporting means you have to air all sides of the story, that you have to publish a counterpoint to every point. But as a scientist, I would rather not give equal column inches to, layperson with a conspiracy theory versus someone with truly, peer-reviewed. So I think that's one thing that needs to happen is we need to help. And I don't know whether there needs to be new protections put in place for journalists so that they can discredit a source or, drop some information for legit reasons and be protected. The other practice that I'm seeing lately that really bothers me is when otherwise reputable news sources are placing chum boxes on their websites as a revenue source. And I empathize with the news media because it's harder and harder to come by revenue now. And like you say, you want people to have access to the news. You don't want to put it behind a paywall. How else do you pay for it? But I feel chum boxes they're bad enough on any website, but they're particularly egregious on a news website because they look like news and they are not only spreading misinformation, but they can literally be harmful, like in a data mining way or, So those are a couple of things that I'd like to see if we can't find another way.
Explain for the crowd what chum boxes are.
So chum boxes are these panels that go on the bottoms of websites, news sites and other sites that have what look like news stories. But they're designed to take you through a web of many, 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 many clicks through many, many, many sites and see many, many, many ads and maybe give up your data several times along the way. And they tend to be things about, weird vegetables or some new medical cure. They're...
Of course.
Yeah, and I see them on websites of news media that I genuinely admire and that I think are quality organizations, and then there they are at the bottom of the page.
I think that one thing to respond, I agree with both of your points, and I think one thing to respond to one of your points is there's like a journalism meme that went around a while ago that I think about still sometimes, and it's like if someone tells you it's raining and someone tells you it's not raining, your job isn't to write both stories down, it's to go outside and figure out if it's raining. And I think that is something that we as journalists have to, journalism has always had both a subjective component and a curation component. There's always a barrier of entry. Not everyone just gets to have column inches to say whatever they want. We decide what we think is newsworthy, what we don't think is newsworthy, who we think is a reliable source, who we do not. There has always been a level of curation involved in journalism, and I think that is something we have to think about. And is who are we granting our platforms to? What ideas are we advancing? Because no, it's not. And I think we need to think much more about fairness than we do about either objectivity or even balance. Is this the fairest version of the story, right? For example, take an issue like climate change, global warming, which by all objective measures is clearly happening and is clearly a crisis. That the broad consensus of all climate scientists is that this is an urgent issue we have to address. It does not mean I cannot find you someone who would say the opposite, but that there is not much objective debate among the people whose job it is to know the answer to this, that this is the thing that's happening. How do I, one, not give equal credence to the outlier, the one scientist of the 100, the one dentist who says, actually, the toothpaste will kill you, and the other 99 go, we don't know what this guy's talking about, and if he's even really a dentist, right? But how do I do that in a way that is not dismissive or condescending to the real people who may also have questions and concerns, right? Because and I think that's more difficult, right? You can't write about something like climate change and pretend as if a bunch of people don't have real questions about if it's real. Now, again, I don't think that necessarily means we have to give the column inches to the people perpetuating that idea, but I think we've got to at least grapple with that question of how a divergent opinion, even when the opinion is factually wrong, how we reflect that reality in the conversation of our coverage. The reality being that there are people who do not believe the true thing. And I think we just got to think about that.
In Michigan, we are extraordinarily fortunate to have Bridge Magazine. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I would hope you become familiar with it, and anybody in this room who's not familiar with it, subscribe to it. It's an online print media out of the University of Michigan. And it is truly, truly nonpartisan in its reporting. So much so that it can get you angry when they're not reinforcing what you believe.
Of course.
But I thought of Bridge when you spoke of the missed stories. You read these stories in Bridge Magazine, and you think, how was this not reported in the Tri-City area? Why wasn't this in the Free Press? And because it's a critical article for Michiganders.
Mm-hmm.
And upstate, and Midwesterners in general.
Sure.
And yet, it's subscription, but anybody can access it, anyone. And my question to you is there a movement for our great universities, or maybe our smaller universities, which are achieving greatness through journalism programs, like CMU has for years and years, moving towards this model that Bridge has? I mean, I'm asking both of you that question because it's a beautiful model. It's what we need for the future.
I do think that there is a sense in a lot of different places that there are big reporting holes, big questions that aren't being answered, big storylines that aren't being followed, and stories that aren't being followed up on. I have a colleague who said, I like to steal the smart things my colleagues say and then say them when I'm talking to people. I have a colleague who once said in a talk we were doing, he goes, you either want to be the first person to write about a story or the last person. And what I added to that is I think too much of our journalism tries to be the first person and not enough of it's the last person. We write most of our journalism when we have the least amount of information, and there's a lot to be said for, all right, let's go back to that case from 2 years ago where now all the paperwork's available. Well, now everyone will do an interview where we can actually ask every question, right, and actually get every answer. And I think that we do, journalism now misses what we used to have. We used to consider the Sunday takeout, right? And so you'd have the news story that happened all week, and then on Sunday the paper would tell you what really happened. Because now they've had a whole week, they talked to everyone, they figured it all out, right? And we've got two simultaneous things happening in the industry. The first is that folks are losing jobs, newsrooms are smaller, that just to get covering the news of the day every day, you don't have time to break someone off and let them just work on a thing for Sunday anymore. But second, the news is moving so quickly that by the time we get to Sunday, we've forgotten the thing we cared about on Monday. And so I think that we've got to combat those two things. We've got to figure out a way where we have, whether it's publications done at the university level, whether it's what the alt weeklies used to do in many cases, alternative press or specific press, right? Whether it be the black press or the LGBTQ press, right? All of these layers of journalism have been hollowed out. And so what we're seeing, the upshot of that, is we're seeing less journalism that's divorced from the news cycle and then has time to exhale and breathe and consider and go back to a source multiple times. And we're just seeing less journalism like that because the people who are working in journalism are being asked to do a million different things and aren't necessarily being given the time and the resources to do them.
One piece of a solution to that is some funding collaboratives that are becoming available. For example, the ones that come to mind, Report for America, I think this is American Journalism Project. And so these are often involving wealthy individuals who have a very deep interest in journalism, and they make funding available to help bolster journalism in either topical areas or geographic areas that can use that. Report for America, I know there are many organizations, but one of our partner newspapers, the Traverse City Record Eagle, has a journalist coming in from Report for America this summer, who will then work for them for a year on a specific, and I forget what topic they have chosen, to be honest, but a specific topic that they've identified as important to their area. So some of these funding collaboratives may help address that, and often there is encouragement of not-for-profit media, think Bridge Magazine, which does a great job. Think public media to an extent, although that's a little different than other nonprofit models, to try and bolster the ecosystem. I saw a hand way in the back.
I have to say, when I was a youngster, one of the experiences that I really appreciated was reading the weekly reader in my school. And
I love that.
And we really learned a lot about the world, and I think critical thinking. I don't know if there's a weekly reader made anymore, but
Oh, yes.
it's still out there. We should try to promote it in our local schools because it really can help gather the interest of the population. I was thinking of the newspapers as a cornerstone of democracy. And if we want to continue to have readership, I look around and there are a lot of us today, we're not in school, but we probably learned a lot when we were little because we had access to newspapers, and maybe the access now isn't so much just in the newspaper, but we have to put at the university level, but we have many children coming up, and to get them interested and involved at an early age will help to secure future interest, I think, in newspaper readership, curiosity about the truth.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and encouraging literacy, period, when you're combating the mobile devices that are with our kids 24/7.
Thank you for calling on me. So I'm Junior Joan, I know a lot of you, but my voice isn't all that strong, so put up your hand if you can't hear me. I just feel news is going in the way of stories, and I agree with Ron when he says it's what they don't talk about as well as what they talk about. And so personally, I'm not sort of mad at the news people. I feel it's a personal responsibility for the reader or the watcher or the listener to expose themselves or seek out as wide a selection of viewpoints as you can, and then you decide. So I will look at Breitbart, but I will read the New York Times or Politico or whatever. I'm just interested. Who's covering what, right? What do I need to think about? And I'm more towards personal responsibility. I guess that's what I'm saying. And everyone in this room has say over what they seek out. And so I guess it's a question. I don't know if you agree with me, but it's a question. How many of you are seekers? Because my friends lean left, they lean right. The left, they won't look right. The right, they won't look left. But I think that's blinders. You can't be a citizen and successfully, what do I want to say, reflect on things if you have blinders on. So that's my hope, my suggestion, and just a little personal viewpoint.
And we are needing to wrap up. I'm going to take one more question from way in the back. You've been waiting patiently, and this will be our last question.
I actually have a question about social media platforms. So we know that most of our news is shared across social media. And I found it really interesting that you deleted your Twitter. That's how I first started following you.
Mm-hmm.
But you still have a Facebook page.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious about how you see that platform, especially as more news comes out about how they're handling truth and what they deem is truthful or not having standards. I'm just curious on your...
No, it's a really good question. And I'll say my Twitter will be back. I'm taking for those of you who know journalists, that tends to be the platform we personally get the most addicted to. And so I, over the holidays and on vacation, was like, what I don't need is this energy for a few months, and so now I can look at my phone without immediately opening my Twitter app for a little bit. And so once I have a story or a project that publishes, I'll turn the button back on so I can share it with folks and whatnot, right? Look, I think a few things are true. I think the first is that, our social media platforms are massive players in our politics and our society. I don't mean this as any partisan political statement. I don't think we've done a particularly good job of regulating or oversight of these platforms, right? We suddenly have these massive communication tools that connect us across the country, allow us all to publish information to each other, indoctrinate each other, meet up in these groups and talk about things. And I don't know that at a very high level, there's been very much thought about what that does to our culture, does to our society, and what, if any, guardrails need to apply to that. And it certainly does not seem like at the very beginning of their infancy, the sites and the social media companies themselves did a particularly good job of this, right? I think that's a pretty mild way of putting it. I think that we have to think really hard about the role that social media outlets play in our society, about what it does to our psychology, even individually. I think sometimes, like, is it a good thing that I know what's happening in the lives of every person I've ever met? Maybe it's not. Like maybe it would be nice if I didn't know that a girl I sat next to in 4th grade had a baby yesterday. Maybe it'd be nice to be pleasantly surprised sometimes. You run into someone from college and you actually don't know what's going on in their life, and so you can ask them, and they tell you. You go, "Oh, that's awesome! You got married. I didn't know that." Versus a bunch of interactions where we're all pretending to not have already seen all the photos of everyone's lives. Oh, you guys were where for Christmas? Well, I didn't. I knew. I saw it. It was on the feed. And so I think that there's a lot to be said for that. I think that as journalists, I think as members of the media, we have to think about, I think it's important for us to be in all of these places if it's a place where readers are. I think we have to be willing to engage. We had a lot of media outlets who were like, why would we create a Facebook page? We don't need to do that. People will just buy the newspaper, they want to read our stuff, and that did not work out very well for us. And so I think we've learned that lesson as an industry broadly, that we need to be in the places where our readers are. We have to find ways to bring information to our readers. We need to remain relevant in a way that we might not be if we weren't actively trying to do it. And so I think about that kind of stuff a lot. And last thing I said, this kind of bookends it because I said a lot of this at the beginning, I think. I also think we got to be accessible. And I think social media is one way that we're accessible. I hear from readers on Twitter and Facebook messages all the time who I might not hear from otherwise. I get story ideas that way. I find out about typos in my pieces that I can get fixed that way, right? And so I think it's really important for us to be in the spaces where our readers are. I always say this to students, although that's not anyone in this room, I don't think, but it's true of you all as well. If there's ever anything that you want to say to me, feel free to reach out. My email is easy to find. I'm on all the social media platforms, whether it's feedback on work that we're doing, story ideas of things that we should be doing, the fact that you think everything I said today was nonsense, let me know. I think it's important for us to be in conversation with our readers, because if we talk, in media spaces, we talk a lot about trust. We talk about our relationship between media outlets and our readers, our viewers, our listeners. And you can't have a relationship without having a relationship. You have to talk to people, and those conversations work in two directions. It's not just me showing up and spouting off whatever my ideas are. It's listening to the folks who consume our media about what they want, what they think's working, what they think isn't working. And so I'd encourage you all, as responsible, as dedicated news consumers, not just with me, but with your local press, with your regional press, with your state press, right? Part of being news literate, part of being a responsible and engaged news consumer is having that two-way conversation, letting the media outlet know when they get something wrong, letting them know when they do a great job, remembering at the beginning of the year to renew those subscriptions, and being actively engaged in this process, because as we all know, our free press is really important to our democracy, right? And it's something that I think we all should support, both with our energy, with our minds, but also sometimes with our wallets, and by coming out to stuff like this. And so thank you all for being here. It's been really great chatting and talking. I've really appreciated the conversations and the questions. I'm sure between here and the door, we'll have many more. But like I said, thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting your local media outlets here. I mean, you guys seem to have some really great and dedicated local journalists in this community. And I know they appreciate the fact that on a day like this is a room full of people who want to come out and talk about these ideas. And so thank you all for being here. It's been great meeting you.
More or less on time. Thank you to the CMU's Critical Engagement Series, which they kind of carried the freight to bring Wesley here. We do appreciate them sharing him with us, and the Department of Journalism at CMU, and Midland Daily News. Great partners. Thank you all for coming in.